All right, good morning, everyone. I have the time as 10 a.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. I first want to thank everyone for joining us for this collaborative webinar with KSU TAB and Laneshift. I also want to remind everyone that this is webinar 1 of 2. The second webinar is going to be on February 19th. Same time. When you registered for this webinar, you also were automatically registered for that one, and it's with the same Zoom link. But with that, we're going to get started. Today, we are going to talk about kind of the confluence of brownfields and active transportations networks. Whether that be that you might be developing an active transportation network in your community, you might run across some brownfield sites, or as you do brownfields redevelopment, you might be thinking about how do I make a more connected community. So we're going to approach this webinar sort of in both ways. But before we get started, let's go over some technical notes. If you experience any issues during this webinar with connection, go ahead and call the phone number listed here or email chsr@ksu.edu. If for whatever reason all else fails and you're locked out, please also note that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available on our website where you registered for the event. The link is also going to be put in the chat so you can access that later. And then also going over some basic Zoom etiquette. I know we live in a post-COVID world, so we're probably all very familiar with this. But if due to the high volume of participants today, everyone should be muted and their video is off. But if for whatever reason it's not, go ahead and hit mute and turn your video off as well. If you want to show your participation in today's webinar, you are able to change your name in the chat. So if for whatever reason you want to do that, you can do it. And then feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar in the chat. We would like you to ask it to everyone so everyone can see the answers, but if you want to send a private message to one of the hosts, that's fine as well. And we have people monitoring the chat, so they might answer it as we get it, but we'll also save some for the end. So today's speakers, so I'm Leslie Etzel. I'm the Assistant Director for KSU TAB in EPA Region 6. And then my co-presenter today is going to be Ryan Hale. He's the founder and CEO of Laneshift, one of KSU TAB's partners. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to do a quick introduction to KSU TAB, who we are, what we do. Ryan with Laneshift is also going to do that. And then I'm going to give kind of the Brownfields 101 talk for anyone who's new to the Brownfields world. We're going to go over what that is, the definition of it, what to look for in Brownfields properties. We'll go through the redevelopment process for brownfield sites. And then we're also going to look at a case study where an active transportation network butts up along several brownfields properties, and that assessment and redevelopment of those properties really changed a community. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, and Ryan's going to talk about a connected community model that they've developed in Laneshift, and then things you should think about while you're planning, designing, and programming for active transportation networks. And then we're going to do a bit of question and answer and a final wrap up. Okay, so KSU TAB, who we are and what we do. So for anyone who doesn't know, TAB stands for Technical Assistance to Brownfields. It's a national program funded by US EPA. There are 5 different TAB providers in the country right now, KSU TAB being one of them. And the TAB providers provide free, tailored assistance to communities. And this is to help with the Brownfields process, whether that be kind of helping you find various funding sources, doing grant review, hosting webinars like this or workshops. We also have some e-tools. So we do a lot of things to help communities throughout the Brownfields redevelopment process. And in terms of KSU TAB, we cover 21 states and we're in EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so I'm going to just go over real quick our team at KSU TAB. So I know a lot of y'all are kind of from all over the country. These are the people you're going to be contacting directly for assistance, maybe if you want some follow-up after this webinar. So if you're in EPA Region 5, we have Beth, Roxanne, and Kristen going left to right. In EPA Region 6, you have Scott Nightingale, my supervisor, and myself. In Region 7, we have Maggie, Jacob, and Kristen. And then in EPA Region 8, we have Maggie and Kate. All of our contact information is on our website at ksutab.org. So if you guys ever need to reach out to us to talk with us about some Brownfields assistance, you can find that on our website. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to talk about Laneshift and what they do.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As Leslie mentioned, we are Laneshift. We're a planning and design firm that's really laser focused on active transportation. Our work spans from working with cities to develop active transportation plans, bike and ped plans, and project-specific plans on how to connect key destinations within communities. We also work to design various aspects of active transportation infrastructure and have a strong capability in 3D design and visualization to help communities visualize really what's possible on a facility or on a corridor. And finally, we have a specific focus on professional development. And we work closely with engineers, planners, members of city staff, and others to train and educate them on the core principles of connected communities. Next slide, please. As you can see, we're a small, but we're a scrappy team. And on the call today, I believe we have Jake Truman, our lead designer. The rest of our team is out working on different things, different projects. So glad to be here today and glad to be talking about these very important topics.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, so let's dive into Brownfields 101. I know, probably some of you are familiar with this, but we'll go over this for any new folks on the call who, this is kind of their first time hearing about Brownfields. So what exactly is a brownfield? The legal definition is a real property in which the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. I really want to point out the potential presence in that legal definition. So one thing to kind of keep in mind is almost all properties are brownfields until proven otherwise. Especially if you're kind of looking to acquire some properties that might look like these 4 images. Always do your environmental due diligence before purchasing or acquiring, and we'll kind of get into that in a couple slides. But so brownfields properties generally have, liability concerns. They maybe have been vacant for quite a while because nobody knows. Everyone's kind of scared, like what's on the property, how much is it going to take to clean it up? But also because of that, they usually have low acquisition costs. You might have a seller who's ready to kind of get rid of it. Maybe they're not able to maintain it, take care of it, assess it, and clean up. And then some other things about brownfields properties. Generally, they're eligible for a lot of grant funds and tax incentives. So we really kind of want to help demystify these properties, make them less scary, and make them something that you're comfortable taking on. So Brownfield's law, that went into place in 2002. It essentially provided liability protections for buyers of these properties, but it is also what provided funding for the Brownfields program. And just some key things about the Brownfields program itself. It's not available to just anyone. You have to be some sort of local government, a nonprofit, a state, or a tribe. There is a big emphasis on community involvement in these sites and their redevelopment. And there has to also be some sort of community benefit, whether that being, the redevelopment creates jobs, provides housing, increases tax revenue, things like that. So I'm going to go kind of through these 4 things on how to tackle brownfields. This is not an all-encompassing list of how to tackle them, but it's just sort of for anyone who's new to the brownfields world, this is kind of, a good stepping stone of how to go through the process, how to think about these sites when you take them on. So first thing is do your environmental due diligence. So earlier I said, every property is a brownfields until proven otherwise. The way you kind of figure that out is through a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Always, always, always do this before you acquire a property. First of all, that will help provide liability protections for you when you purchase it. But also it's your golden ticket to brownfields funding. Now you can do a phase 1 environmental site assessment completely on your own without brownfields funding if you want. The average cost is about $5,000, but as you'll see, I'm going to kind of talk about the funding. You can get funding to do that phase 1, so you don't necessarily have to do it out of your own pocket. So the types, there's 2 types of funding that are available for these assessments and cleanups. You kind of have non-competitive funding and then competitive funding. So your non-competitive funding would be, you could contact your regional EPA office to see if they have some what are called targeted brownfields assessment funds. You can also contact a state brownfields program. So example, in Louisiana, there's the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. There might be some local brownfields programs that have funding, such as like a regional planning commission or a council of government. A lot of those, depending, it might be just first come, first serve. And it's really going to depend on how much funding they have available at the time. And then there is the competitive grant funding, which we're going to go into in the next section. But essentially, in this case, you would be, writing a grant proposal, submitting it to EPA. If you are awarded, you're going to be hiring your own environmental contractors to perform the assessments and/or cleanup. So the type of competitive funding that is available, I didn't put it in the exact order that they advertise it, but this is sometimes commonly referred to as the MARC grants. So that stands for the multi-purpose grant, assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup. But assessment grant does exactly that. You can do soil and groundwater sampling, cleanup planning. Multi-purpose, you can do assessments and cleanups of properties. Cleanup, obviously is that, but you can also do some long-term health monitoring, enforcement of some institutional controls. And then revolving loan fund, just for anyone who's not familiar with that, that's generally done kind of like maybe at a regional planning level or a state level, where they're getting funds and then they are providing low interest or no interest loans to communities for individual brownfield sites to clean them up. And then lastly, get help from your TAB provider. So kind of talking about the 3 steps above it, there's all these different grant opportunities that are available. It can be kind of daunting to try and figure out who's got money. And especially if you're new to the world, you don't necessarily know who the contacts are. Reach out to one of your TAB providers, whether it be us or the other TABs throughout the country. And, we work with these entities all the time. We'll help you navigate and figure out who has funding for you. If you do decide to go for a competitive grant, KSU TAB has a grant writing software, TAB EZ. We also provide grant reviews. We can also help you with your environmental contractor procurement. We can also help you review technical documents like those phase 1s and phase 2s and kind of give you some advice on what are next steps. And again, we do so much more than that, but we'll kind of get into all the different services that we provide in webinar 2. Okay, so let's actually go through step by step the redevelopment process for Brownfields sites. This is a general just like kind of timeline of or step by step process. Generally speaking, with Brownfields, this isn't always done in this exact order. Sometimes there's a lot of like kind of jumping around. But mainly there is a planning stage in Brownfields redevelopment, the actual environmental portion where you're doing the assessments and cleanups, and then finally the revitalization aspect where you're redeveloping the property. And at the bottom, it just kind of shows the types of grants that you would access during these different stages. So we're going to kind of go through each of these steps and just kind of spell out, I guess, a little bit of advice on how to approach this. So determining reuse vision and goals. Whether you're just starting out and you have absolutely no idea where any of your brownfield sites are, or if you know where they are, but you're not sure how you want to redevelop them. This is kind of a place to gather your key stakeholders and engage with your community. Your community can help you identify those brownfield sites. They can help you identify the types of redevelopments they want to see. Maybe what are the needs? Are there any critical services gaps? Things like that. Also, community engagement is pretty important in when you're applying for competitive grants. They want to see how engaged you already are with the community before you're even applying, that there's community buy-in and you're going to be receptive to their feedback. And then, so once you've kind of gathered your community, you know what the vision is, you start setting redevelopment goals. Maybe your redevelopment goals are already reflected in a community plan. If you don't already have one, maybe start working on it and see kind of where Brownfields fits into that. And so you kind of go from there. And then identifying and prioritizing brownfield sites. So again, your community can help you identify these sites. And things to think about are properties with asbestos or lead-based paint, maybe some old gas station, vacant lots, abandoned buildings, old meth labs. Here in Texas, we have a lot of historic oil and gas activities, things like that. And then there are, for kind of exploring where potential brownfield sites are, there's PEER, the platform for exploring environmental records. That'll kind of give you a good indication of whether or not the site might be a brownfield. So encourage everyone to explore that. And then KSU TAB also has what's called a Brownfields inventory tool, commonly referred to as BIT, that can help you track and manage your brownfield sites as you identify them. And a little plug, we have a webinar coming up on February 11th for the new launch of our Brownfields inventory tool. So be sure to check that out if you are interested in some sort of brownfields management database. And then as you start identifying sites, once you kind of get a good list going, That list is probably always growing, but once you've got, a few sites, start prioritizing them. And prioritization can look however you want it to look. It might be that you want to prioritize sites in underserved communities or environmental justice areas. Maybe you want to prioritize the sites that pose the biggest health risk or environmental risk, or prioritize sites that align with some sort of other redevelopment goal. Maybe that being that, hey, these brownfields properties are right, either the active transportation network we want to put in goes right through these brownfields properties or butts up right against it. And we want to kind of tackle those to either stimulate economic growth along the path and also, encourage safety and better health. Okay, so once you've got your list of brownfield sites, you've prioritized them. Maybe you're gonna do this site by site through some sort of non-competitive brownfields grant, or you're actually gonna go that competitive route. You're essentially gonna start doing your phase 1 environmental site assessments. And then based on the results of that, you'll want to potentially do a phase 2, where you're going to collect soil and groundwater samples, maybe some air samples as well. And then based on that, you might have to do some supplemental assessments, and then some cleanup planning. So states, depending on if you have contamination above a certain level and based on maybe what you want to redevelop it into, the state environmental agency might say, a cleanup is needed at the site, and you'll start evaluating the costs for your different cleanup options. And then I'm not going to go through this full slide. I could spend a lot of time talking about cleanup as a geologist. But essentially the thing to think about and remember with cleanup is making sure that your cleanup remedy really matches the future use of the property. So states and EPA have various standards for the level of contamination that is allowed to be present for residential redevelopment or commercial industrial. So you always need to be engaging with whichever entity is applicable to make sure your cleanup plan is appropriate for that redevelopment. And then kind of lastly in that redevelopment process, well, I shouldn't say lastly, because leveraging funding and resources should be done throughout the entire brownfields process. And so in the planning and the environmental stage, you can access those EPA brownfields grants to help you with that. There's other grants that are available for redevelopment. There's also historic tax credits. So always explore the different funding sources that are out there. Many people refer to the brownfields funding to get a site from start to finish as like a wedding cake. It's very layered. There's not a single grant out there that's going to take a site from, needing assessment and cleanup to completely redeveloped. So it's really about finding the different resources out there and layering them. Okay, so now we're going to change gears a little bit now that we kind of understand brownfields and the redevelopment process, and talk about kind of that confluence between brownfields and active transportation networks. And we're going to look at a case study. So this is in my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina. We're specifically going to look at the Swamp Rabbit Trail and look at the brownfields work that was done right along the Swamp Rabbit Trail. So just a little bit of information about the actual trail. So it's a 28-mile long active transportation network. I believe they started breaking ground on this trail in 2006 or 2005. And it has less than 5% grade, so it is super easy for all users. And one thing I'll note, and I know Ryan's going to touch on this in his presentation, but upstate Greenville, when I was young, was kind of this mecca for cyclers. George Hincapie or Lance Armstrong, those kind of cyclers. But as this Swamp Rabbit Trail got developed, it really started to shift. And the upstate became a biking mecca for all people, all ages, all experience level. So one thing to think about is, how to make your transportation networks more inclusive for all users. And the Swamp Rabbit Trail, I think, is a great prime example of that. And so the trail goes through 3 major cities in the upstate. So it goes through Travelers Rest, Greenville, and Fountain Inn. There's 10 different parks along the trail, a university, a 400-acre nature preserve. And then in 2023, there were 8,000 users of the trail, and they estimate that 2,000 of those users were daily users. So I think that's pretty remarkable. Another little statistic I like to show is the South Carolina average of bike commuters, like to and from work, is 0.5%. So very, very low throughout the state. But the people along the Swamp Rabbit Trail who use it to commute to work represent 16.4%. So Greenville and kind of the surrounding areas of the Swamp Rabbit Trail are, way different than the state as a whole. So I think it just shows how the Swamp Rabbit Trail is being used in very positive ways. So kind of focusing on actual brownfield sites along the Swamp Rabbit Trail. In the map that you see, hopefully you guys can see it pretty well, there are red dots. These red dots represent brownfield sites that have been assessed and or cleaned up through the City of Greenville's Brownfields program. And as you can see, there are a lot of red dots immediately adjacent to the bike path. So this is something that you guys might be running into as you develop these sites, as you develop active transportation networks, is going through areas with brownfields. And then if we kind of hone in on the west end of Greenville, so this was historically a Black and Brown community. It also had high and a lot of industrial activities throughout its history. The red square represents a half square mile, and there were a lot of EJ concerns for years at this site. And the path going through the red square is actually one of the first portions of the Swamp Rabbit Trail that they put in. And so within this square, there are 19 different brownfield sites. And if you go to EPA's website, Clean Up to My Community, you can look at all the information for each individual site. And in doing so, I calculated that about $127,000 of EPA assessment funds were spent directly on these sites. One of the sites needed, well, I think several of the sites needed cleanup, but the City of Greenville got a cleanup grant for one of them, and it was for $200,000. And then through the assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment of these 19 brownfield sites, $134 million were leveraged. A major portion of that is in natural redevelopment, but there were funds leveraged for the assessment and cleanup as well. The jobs created from these redevelopments was 370, and I believe 350 of those are actual permanent jobs. Now, these numbers are pretty old. I want to say these numbers maybe go back to 2018. There have been quite a number of newer developments in this area. So I'm pretty positive that the leveraged fundings and jobs created is actually much, much higher as of 2025. So some of the of those red dots I showed you in that red square, these are some of the major brownfields redevelopments that occurred. So one of the biggest ones is Unity Park right here. So this is a 60-acre site that has, a really awesome kids playground. It has a splash pad, tons of green space. And then also within that, this building, this kind of chunk of buildings here, if you guys can see my cursor, is also, that's the Commons, which is another Brownfields redevelopment. It's got a couple different shops and then a food hall, beer hall in it. And then the site that needed cleanup that the city of Greenville got a cleanup grant for is the Salvation Army Croc Center. So there was an area in their parking lot. They used to have a UST that they did a cleanup for. It's now part of their parking lot. But this is now a kids like STEM facility where they do a lot of after-school education and programming. Also part of that, they have this massive tennis complex. One of the properties is also Embassy Suites, which obviously, created a lot of permanent jobs, brings in a lot of money for the city. The Children's Garden, that was one of the first Brownfields redevelopments in Greenville. So this is right under the bridge it's South Academy Street that separates downtown Greenville from the West End. When the Swamp Rabbit Trail was first put in, this is where you would go and park to jump on the Swamp Rabbit Trail. And it's just a really cute, fun park underneath the bridge. And then just a brand new development that just was completed last year is the board and office space. That is going to be a mixed use commercial facility, and I imagine it's going to bring a lot more jobs and tax revenue to the area. So the economic impact of the Swamp Rabbit Trail, it's pretty incredible in my opinion. The first 22 miles of the trail cost $9 million to develop. Right now, the Greenville County estimates that the trail itself brings in about $10 million annually. So in 2023, a survey showed that there were 500 businesses located within 500 feet of the trail. From my personal experience, the second part of this is not a true statistic, but just from my own observation, I would say in 2005, before the trail went in, there was about a third of that. So that's how much it has changed, how much that area has changed because of this active transportation network. So if you want to read more or learn more about the Swamp Rabbit Trail, there's a QR code to it. If anyone ever wants to visit, I highly recommend it. Reach out if you want any restaurant recommendations. And then, so to wrap up my portion of the presentation, why is KSU TAB talking to us about active transportation networks? So right now we partner with Laneshift to provide selected communities scholarships to their active transportation academy, as well as to the Jumpstart program. I'm going to let Ryan talk more to that specifically. But we do provide scholarships for that. We also provide one-on-one consultation with communities about developing active transportation networks. We can also, as you are developing those active transportation networks, we can help you identify different brownfield sites along them, and what sites may be great to redevelop into something that would benefit that trail. A lot of people like to see a small bike shop along a trail, or a cute small place that I can stop and get coffee or a beer or a croissant or something while you're on your ride. We can kind of help you do market analysis for that. And with that, I'm going to kind of wrap up our portion of it and turn it over to Ryan to talk about specifically how Laneshift helps with active transportation networks.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. That's exciting. I haven't had a chance to visit the Swamp Rabbit Trail yet, but that is on my bucket list to go see. So, our goal today, really, for the next 25, 30 minutes or so, is to really dive into what it means to be a connected community, how to get there, and some of the things that you can focus on in your community's journey to become better connected through active transportation. So, Leslie, next slide, please. One more. Over the years, we have learned that infrastructure and culture are required to become really a connected community. Next slide. To help us better communicate this, a few years back through a lot of our professional development programs, we developed what we call the connected community model. And what the model shows us is that communities must focus on planning, designing, and building safe, comfortable, and connected active transportation infrastructure, and be just as intentional and strategic in developing a welcoming, inclusive, and encouraging active transportation culture. Next slide, please. So as we drop in, kind of two sides to this equation is the infrastructure side, and obviously, safety is paramount, but we also want that to be useful. We want that to be connected so that it's not just a trail to nowhere, but it's actually designed in a way that connects to key destinations and services throughout the community. And then we obviously want that to be comfortable. We want that to be kind of what we call an all ages, all abilities facility. Next slide, please. We also, as we think about the culture, we really want to develop a culture for people that are walking, biking, rolling, or running. We want to develop a culture within our community that's that's welcoming, inclusive, and encouraging. Next slide, please. We used to believe in our work in the heartland and in rural America that if you build it, they will use it. And that was kind of the model that we promoted for many, many years. And that approach works in places like New York City, San Francisco, Portland, and in large metro areas where there's what we call latent demand. But it hasn't always panned out that way in smaller rural America. We've learned, as I mentioned before, that communities must be focused on building a culture of walking, biking together and in tandem with infrastructure development to see community buy-in and usage increase. So if you would like, you can snap that QR code and you can get a little bit more detail on some of the critical questions that we've developed in the model. It's not designed to be a rule. It's not designed to be exhaustive of all considerations that you need to think about in building infrastructure and culture, but there's just some critical questions there that as you're beginning your planning process or trying to grow your active transportation network, both you and your stakeholders can be asking some of these questions as you develop. So some questions to be thinking about from a safety standpoint. Does the space feel appropriate for people of all ages and all abilities? Are conflicts minimized at intersections and along bikeways? Are there sight lines that are appropriate? From a comfort perspective, is the is the area attractive? Is traveling by bike or on foot, is it intuitive? And then on the connected side, is the infrastructure connected to residential areas? Are there other forms of multimodal transportation that are present? And then just a few questions on the culture side. We won't go through each one of these, but what percentage of the community's infrastructure would be considered all ages and all abilities? In what ways is the culture empathetic to all people using active transportation? And then on the encouraging side, how does the community celebrate successes and health-related benefits of active transportation? Next slide, please. So bear with me. Let's do just a quick question, and you can use the chat and just plug in some of your answers in the chat. As you think about what a strong and healthy community is, how would you define that? What are some of the things that come to mind for you as you think about a strong and healthy community? Just plug that into the chat. We'll take just a few seconds to read some of those responses. Strong communities. Diverse interconnectivity, that's good. Anybody else? How do you define that? Strong and healthy community. What are the attributes of that? Stable, safe, clean air and water, engagement, yeah, quality of life, vibrant, welcoming, diverse attractions and services, good. Those are great. I know that you guys are probably following along. Community involvement with planning, those are all great thoughts, and those are consistent with many of the times where we ask that question to groups in our training and education. Those are consistent. You know, building great communities is not easy. It's hard work. We all know that. We face many local, state, and national challenges. Funding, community buy-in, competing priorities can all present challenges. That said, we're facing a few challenges nationally that really provide and show some compelling data on why we really should be focusing on improving connectivity through infrastructure and culture. Slide number 45, please, Leslie. First and foremost, we are facing a significant rise in pedestrian fatalities across the country. To be exact, we've seen a 75% increase in pedestrian fatalities on our streets and roads since 2010, with lower income residents experiencing higher rates of fatalities. We also see in the far right-hand corner, we also see that more than 50% of these fatalities are a result of a vehicle failing to yield the right-of-way to pedestrians. Something in that data point speaks to our culture and how we view people on foot and on bikes, often when we get behind the wheel of a vehicle. Next slide, please. We're also seeing some other unexpected motivations for change. In 2024, the Surgeon General produced an exhaustive report outlining what they are calling the epidemic of loneliness. The data in the report shows that we are spending less time in community, less time connecting with others, less time connecting with family and friends, and it's having really a profound effect on our health. The report shows that social isolation, you can see in the graphic on the right, the report shows that social isolation is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day and has become a leading cause of morbidity, outpacing alcoholism, obesity, and physical inactivity. So we do have some challenges, and we do have some real motivations for creating connected communities. Next slide, please. While these challenges related to, basic safety and connection are very real, they can also serve to help catalyze change. And we believe that active transportation can play an important role in helping to change these trends within your community. Let's kind of look at a few of the positive benefits, and I know Leslie touched on a couple of these with that specific project there in Greenville. But let's discuss some of those positive benefits that you can gain from additional investments in active transportation. We know, and you live this out every day within your communities, is that communities are either growing and taking strides forward or they aren't. And it's often said if you're not growing and you're not taking strides forward, you may be dying. One of the important aspects of a growing, thriving, and healthy community is talent. Talent to work in your companies, attend your universities, start businesses, serve on boards, and become elected officials. Community building has shifted a lot over the last 20 years. We're finding that young talent is searching for communities that they are aligned with and that have a high quality of life and are a great place to live, work, and play. It would have been very surprising to me 20 years ago to hear, or it was very surprising, where young talent is searching for a place that they have some sort of an emotional alignment to, and there's a great quality of life, and they will move there and find a job once they're there. So again, they're searching for great places to live, work, and play. A place that college graduates can't wait to come back to and plug in. We know that the ability for residents to walk and bike for recreation and transportation is a very important factor in the growth of healthy communities. And by embracing active transportation, your community can continue to compete for a hypermobile workforce and be the place where young talent wants to live, work, and play. Next slide, please. We've also seen that evidence that connectivity and more specifically biking can have a major impact on our region's economic development. In 2017, the Walton Family Foundation commissioned a study to analyze the impact of biking, the economic impact of biking in the Northwest region of the state of Arkansas. The study showed what many of us were seeing and living out every day was that biking is a primary economic engine for our region. The study showed that biking alone generates $137 million in annual economic impact on our region in Northwest Arkansas. Next slide, please. You can see from this slide that the study was able to drill down to show that our region has about $86 million in savings in health-related costs. This means that we're more active in Northwest Arkansas, we're visiting the doctor less, and frankly, we're stronger and more emotionally resilient because we're more active. You can also see that there's another $51 million in direct economic benefits associated with people traveling to our area to ride over 400 miles of mountain bike trails and over 200 miles of shared use paved paths. Those people are purchasing bikes, eating in our restaurants, drinking our coffee, staying in our hotels, and really helping stimulate the economy. So there's a heavy tourism aspect, but then there's also, we've seen a major uptake in ridership across the board with residents in Northwest Arkansas choosing for the first time or maybe in decades to purchase a bike and begin to start riding and incorporating biking into their daily routine. This study was updated in 2024, and the overall impact grew to over $159 million. So I think it's important to call out that this is not a cumulative number over decades. This is an annual economic benefit to our region. So as we think about economic development, next slide, please, and we think about the benefits in further investing in connectivity. We often say that there's one more slide, please, Leslie. We often say that there's a human element to this as well, an altruistic side to this work. The reality is that in all of our communities, none of us are immune from this. There are people living in your communities, in my community, who are living in poverty or right on the edge of poverty. And access to a vehicle, frankly, is a luxury. With the cost of vehicle ownership being upwards of $12,000 a year, many families recognize that a vehicle or lack thereof can add tremendous complexity to their lives and can stifle access to jobs, healthcare, and upward mobility. So while talent attraction and economic development are very real factors, providing options for people to move around your city can assist and support residents in accessing the most basic of services. Next slide, please. Communities often ask us, where do we start? And what is the process? Like we want to become more connected. We want more active transportation infrastructure. And really, this graphic provides some of the highlights for you to think about as you are on this journey, if you will. Again, just like the model, it's not intended to be a rule, but rather a tool that you can use to map out essential steps to become more connected or better connected. So kind of the major movements in this roadmap is, first and foremost, is developing a vision, defining success and impact, understanding the purpose behind why you as a community want to become more connected. And it may be different within each community, and it likely will be. What are those guiding principles? And in those early days,
Ryan,
really,
just
yeah.
lost your audio.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. All good? All good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Thank you. So developing that vision is important, rallying early support, and then planning the network, thinking about equity and access, all ages and all abilities. How do we develop facilities that are for people of all ages and all abilities? What are the policies that we're going to dive into? And then really, what's our intentional and strategic outreach into the community? Then we want to focus on building the culture, making that culture welcoming, inclusive, and encouraging. And then finally, sometimes the hard work is the actual implementation, moving from that planning phase into how do we prioritize, maintain, fund, and then really evaluate the success of that. So let's move on to talking a little bit more about infrastructure. As a refresher within infrastructure, next slide, please. We want to focus on developing safe, comfortable, and connected infrastructure. And a term that we use a lot in this world, and as we're talking with communities, and many of you have heard this before, is all ages and all abilities. As we build infrastructure for people to walk, bike, roll, and run, we want that to be able to be used by people of all ages and all abilities. So pause for just a quick moment. And I want you, let me know what comes to mind when I say the word cyclist. What is the mental picture? What is that person wearing? What are they riding? Lycra, helmet, yep. What are they riding? Your first thought is they're blue, or no, I'm sorry, bike. Need to tune up my glasses here. So for most of us, next slide, please. For most of us, as we think about that term cyclist, this is the image that often comes to mind. Not across the board 100%, but for many of us, as we go through this exercise, when we say the word cyclist, this is the image that comes to mind. And I want to make sure we say that this user is an important part of the ecosystem, but they aren't the only user of that system or that network. We often ask community leaders and stakeholders to consider just a simple vernacular and thinking change as they're developing their active transportation network. So if I were to pose a different question, what image comes to mind when I say the words bike rider or a person on a bike? You can throw a couple responses in the chat if you'd like. Bike rider or a person on a bike? What are some of the mental images that come to mind? having fun riding, good weather, yeah, kids, yeah, anyone in any form is a big range, good, less pollution, a race. So next slide, please. So for many of us, when we think about the term bike rider or a person on a bike, it may look something more similar to this. So as we think about that vernacular change or maybe just a slight thinking change, and we think about building active transportation infrastructure and getting more people riding, if we can make that simple shift of referring to facilities as being, instead of being just for cyclists, we'll likely have a greater reception by decision makers and communities. So as we think about, if we're trying to promote a project or going to city council or talking to stakeholders, if we say we want to build a facility for cyclists, that mental image that we all kind of talked about initially comes to mind. But if we kind of shift that into thinking that we want to build a facility for bike riders, there's a different mental image, and there's probably going to be a broader reception to that. So, and the data really, I think, backs that up. So if you go to the next slide, please. In 2015, Jennifer Dill, who's a well-regarded educator out of Portland, did a nationwide study of about 3,500 people. And she asked those people to identify what type of cyclists do they see themselves as. You could choose strong and fearless, enthused and confident, interested but concerned, or no way, no how. So when you look at this data, if we're being generous and we lump in strong and fearless and enthused and confident, we really have about 12% of people that would view themselves as a cyclist, with about 88% of the population that is interested. I would ride more, but I like riding a bike, but I don't ride much. I would like to feel safer when I do ride with less traffic and slower speeds. So really, as we think about our active transportation network and we want to see more people using the system that we build, really using the facilities and the projects that we invest in, it's not about excluding cyclists, but it's actually creating a broader design, and it's actually accommodating more across the board people of all ages and all abilities. Next slide, please. And one of the most important things that we have to think about as we're developing active transportation infrastructure is we really need to control for speed. Speed matters. This is a design, or excuse me, a graphic from NTSB, National Traffic Safety Board, that shows that how your chances of survival or a fatality based on the speed of a vehicle, if a vehicle's going 20 miles per hour and you're involved in a collision as a pedestrian, you have a 95% chance of survival. Not saying you're not going to be hurt. Not saying there's not going to be some sort of an injury, but your chance of survival is going to be very high. If you double that to 40 miles per hour, we see that you only have about a 15% chance of survival if you're involved in a collision as a pedestrian with a vehicle. So we do know that in order to get more people riding, in order to tap into more of that 88% of the population, we really need to control for speed. A couple other little concepts to think about. Next slide, please. As we think about designing all ages and all abilities facilities, we use this term, and it's just simply called friction. Friction in your system and in your network. This is an example of a facility in a city where each one of those red dots that you see on the map represents a point of transition, or what we would call friction. Now, for most of your cycling community, it's no big deal. Most of the cycling community can easily navigate those. But imagine if you're that bike rider. Imagine if you have a couple kids or you're hauling a bike trailer behind you. Each one of those produces some frustration, and some potential for safety concerns at each one of those red dots. And so as we think about developing a system for lower confidence riders, newer riders, we really want to focus in on reducing the amount of transition and reducing the friction that's available or that's present on a facility. Next slide, please. We'll go through both of these very quickly. This is a quick example of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And when you think about a connectivity, each one of those green lines represents a shared use paved path, like a grade separated, separate facility for a person on a bike. And there's a network there, a network that a person on a bike can have confidence in and know that I can get from my house to the coffee shop, my house to the library, my house to work and back. And I have a network that I can lean into. Next slide, please. And then here's another example of building out a larger network. This is out of Austin, Texas. And so there's multiple facility types that a user can tap into to get from point A to point B. One of the watchouts that we would actually ask you to think about as you're envisioning your active transportation network is that focusing on a greenway only or a shared use paved path only approach to your active transportation network would be akin to an interstate only approach to your vehicular network. The fact of the matter is we have different types of streets and roads and highways that are serve different purposes. And the same thing is true in your active transportation network. Frankly, you likely don't have enough funding available to do a greenway only approach or a shared use paved path 10-foot wide, 12-foot wide across your entire city. But oftentimes, if we can include things like mixed traffic facilities, bike lanes, that really can help complete that network at a fraction of the cost and is actually more context sensitive, if you will. Next slide, please. We'll take just a quick dive into, again, this is not an exhaustive toolbox of everything for you to think about, every facility type, but just some different things that you can think about as a community, some different tools that you might grab and some different facility types. Shared use paved paths, oftentimes they're called greenways. We often think about greenways as being no less than 10 feet wide. These are shared use facilities, so you do have people both walking, rolling, and running, as well as available for bikes, so shared use facilities. The challenge that we run into here, as I mentioned previously, is the cost. In Northwest Arkansas alone, the cost of shared use paved paths runs north of $300 a linear foot. And so, yes, they are considered kind of the interstate, if you will, of the active transportation network. They are at the higher end of safety and comfort. But the fact of the matter is we just simply don't have enough funding available, and it's not always context appropriate to put a shared use paved path in place. Next slide, please. I often share this photo. This is a location in Northwest Arkansas called the Kohler Mountain Bike Preserve. There's a 2-mile greenway that runs through the middle of about a 300-acre parcel with roughly 20 miles of mountain bike trails on the side slopes. And I have to tell you, I think it was a real surprise for all of us in the region to see how many non-bikers, non-people on bikes were actually using this greenway. This is a random, Saturday morning, appears to be in the fall. This is a 12-foot wide facility, and it's getting a lot of use. And so when you have a facility like this, one other little element that I'll add, another surprise is that at the 1 mile mark, there's a coffee shop. And the coffee shop is only accessible by bike and by foot. And when that was being envisioned, I'm certain that there were some that thought, how in the world is this coffee shop going to make it? And you can only access it by bike and by foot. And so the coffee shop went in, and it has been a huge success. We live just near this facility, and on a Saturday morning or a spring or summer evening, you're standing in line for 25 minutes to get a latte because it's wildly successful. So let's move on to slide 65. Another thing to think about in this toolbox of facilities within your community are bike lanes. Really, there's kind of two types of bike lanes. We kind of put those into visually separated. Visually separated would be like a conventional bike lane with little to no buffer, really paint only, and those are typically one-way facilities. And then we also have buffered bike lanes, which is really kind of the same concept, although there's a wider painted buffer. The next is a physically separated bike lane. And what we find is that in most of the visually separated bike lanes, we find that lower confidence or newer riders have more of a challenge there because there's not that physical separation from vehicles, and there can be some concerns for their felt safety in that visually separated facility. So that's why a physically separated facility, such as a separated bike lane or a cycle track, can be really good and useful. So a separated bike lane, just some of the attributes there, they can be one-way or two-way. There's some sort of physical separation you can see in the slides here. There's a lot of different ways to do that. You've got in the middle picture, there's a product from Zikla called the Zikla Zipper. You have a painted buffer, and then there's physical separation. In the top and the bottom slides, it's another product from Zikla called a Zikla Zebra. So those are kind of three ways to achieve that level of separation. Typically, the two-way width is around 12 feet is desirable, but 8 feet is minimum. And then the one-way width, 7 feet is desirable with 5 feet is the minimum. So won't geek out too much on the details. We'll move on to the next slide. Why bike lanes are important and why they can be important to you as you're building out your active transportation network and getting more people riding and walking is this is an example. This is 8th Street in Bentonville, Arkansas. This was about a 60-foot wide corridor that was built, 60-foot wide road that was built that really never hit the targets for volume of vehicle traffic that it was designed for. And so there was a plan and a design to change that and do what's called in the industry called a right sizing of the road or a road diet is kind of the other general term. So here's an example of what it looked like before. Next slide, please. And some examples of what that looks like now. So to take a 5-lane road, 2 lanes of travel plus a center turn lane, reorder that, right size that, and now there was able to be enough room and space for parallel parking on either side of the street, as well as a two-way cycle track that was installed. This was able to be installed at a fraction of the cost of what a grade separated shared use paved path would have cost. And so there's roads and streets within your community where this might be a viable option. Not everywhere. We don't want to look at everything and say, yeah, that needs a road diet, but really to study that and to determine, is this appropriate? So moving on to the next slide. Some other ways to achieve that. This is out of Austin. What you see here in this facility is a protected bike lane, but you have a redundancy. Not only do you have the concrete barrier, you have a colorized bike lane, if you will, that really kind of helps that pop and separate that visually. But then you also have a protection with the parallel parking there as well. Next slide.
Hey Ryan, real quick, just want to give you
Uh,
a 5 minute warning.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Do you have a big hook that you can hook me off, or is it just called mute?
Yeah, just mute. But
Yeah,
yeah, if you just want to wrap
thank,
up.
thank you. I appreciate that. And another quick example is out of Washington, D.C. A lot of times we'll have communities that say, well, we could never do that. It's that road is too important. That road has too much volume. Our community would never buy in. And every context is a little bit different. So I'm not here to tell you that every situation is right for a cycle track or a physically separated bike lane. But this is Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And I would say from an importance standpoint in a community spark standpoint, Pennsylvania Avenue is pretty prime territory, and they were able to install a two-way bike lane, a center-oriented bike lane. So let's move on to slide 70, and I'll touch on this very quickly. Last kind of facility to think about are mixed traffic facilities or shared roadways. Next slide. The way we think about this is how do we help vehicles slow down as we're mixing people on foot and on bike? And there's kind of a model developed by a gentleman named Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's not necessarily for street design, but two ways to think about traffic calming and mixed traffic facilities is system one thinking is fast, subconscious, automatic, everyday decision. So I can do that without thinking. System two is really about slow, conscious, effortful, complex decisions, and it's very reliable. And as we think about developing mixed traffic facilities, it's really about shifting people from I'm on this long, straight, narrow roadway. I can do this in my sleep to over into a system two thinking that we are much more slow, effortful, and it's much more reliable and safer. So next slide. System one thinking would be a road that's designed like this, that people that live on this roadway or use this roadway are able to travel this and kind of, in a sense, kind of go to sleep, if you will. System two is as we introduce inputs into that roadway, there are things that are on the roadway that we really want those vehicles to touch their brakes, be more mindful, and slow down so that we can mix the traffic there. And there's a term in the industry called traffic calming, and there's a whole toolbox that we can use to think about that. So just to recap from an infrastructure standpoint, just some of the tools in your toolbox: shared use paved paths, bike lanes, and then traffic calming. So um, have more to cover, but we'll go ahead and stop there. I think that's a good stopping point, and then turn it back over to Leslie.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, I'm gonna real quick jump out of this. I do want to, Ryan, did you want to real quick give a plug for the Active Transportation Academy?
Yeah. So we're thankful for our partnership with KSU TAB. We're thankful that they have embraced active transportation as a key component in Brownfields redevelopment. As a part of that partnership with KSU TAB, they have provided scholarships. So as you're thinking about how to incorporate connectivity, become more connected as a community, you might want to consider coming to our Active Transportation Academy. The Academy is a 4-day, really deep dive into a lot of the concepts that we talked about today. But we not only just do that in a classroom, we go out into the field and we have that experiential learning component. And if you want to snap the QR code, you can go on and determine if you qualify for a scholarship and then take the next step. It's a very easy application process. Just apply for the scholarship, and we as a team kind of come together and are able to make decisions pretty quickly. and the cost of the program is completely covered through the partnership with KSU TAB. So it may be something to consider as you or somebody else on your team or within your community wants to gain more insights into active transportation. Consider coming to the Active Transportation Academy. And then finally, we hope that you'll join us on the next webinar. We've got an exciting announcement through the partnership with KSU TAB where we're going to be opening up a call for community applications to apply for our Jumpstart program. And the Jumpstart program really provides an on-site workshop where we come to your community. We meet with your stakeholders. We teach some of the same concepts that we taught here, but much deeper. We do a walk audit in your community, and then we produce a report that kind of shows you some things that you can be focused on in growing active transportation in your community. So join us on the webinar on February 19th, where we'll be opening up that call for community applications.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And just to give a plug for Active Transportation Academy, I've had the pleasure of attending. You do learn a lot in this, like Brian's presentation today is just, you know, a snapshot of it. So he really does a great deep dive. I learned quite a lot in it, so. Okay, so wrapping things up, again, a reminder for webinar 2 on February 19th, same time, 10 to 11:30 a.m. Central Time. It's the exact same Zoom link. If you already when you registered for this event, you also are registered for that one. And what we're gonna do in that webinar is we're gonna do a deep dive into the TAB services. Kind of a few of the things we've touched on today, you know, like helping you identify brownfield sites, doing market analysis, but also the types of assistance we help with active transportation networks. And then Ryan's going to go into more detail about that Active Transportation Academy and the Jumpstart program, and then also kind of go through the application process for the Jumpstart. So before we get to questions and answers, we would really love to get your feedback on today's webinar. This is very critical for us at KSU TAB to gauge how we're doing. Make sure that the content we're giving you is really helping educate you on Brownfield, active transportation. We would really appreciate your feedback. So if you want to scan that QR code, I believe they'll drop in the chat the link to that questionnaire. It's really short, but if you would fill that out. And then with that, I'm going to open up to questions. Maggie, Scott, we've got 47 participants, so maybe if you guys want to just tell me if there's any questions, and we can address those.
I am currently not seeing any questions. But if anybody has a question, now is the time. You can drop it in the chat. Or if you want to raise your hand, since we are a little bit smaller group, you can use one of the reactions to raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Let's see, I see one that is, I'm new to being a city planner. Has TAB ever worked directly with municipalities? Yeah, we work directly with communities on all sorts of stuff. I don't know if Maggie, if you want to touch on that more. We specifically work, you know, in terms of like Brownfields redevelopment. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is yes, we do need to have that brownfields focus, but as Leslie, you know, mentioned early in the presentation, brownfields are everywhere. Pretty much any site, any property that's just underutilized is considered a brownfield until proven otherwise. So if you have a, you know, a particular site, maybe it's a corridor or a neighborhood where you do have some, you know, underutilized properties and you're wanting to just maybe even have a initial conversation about where to get started, we'd be happy to do that. I can put my, I think Leslie's contact information's on the slides, but I can drop my email in the chat, and you can shoot me an email and we can schedule a time to chat.
I would also just add to what Maggie said. So I would really encourage anyone, especially if you're new to Brownfields or if you're not familiar with your TAB providers yet, maybe you're not familiar with your state Brownfields folks, start developing those relationships. You can start with TAB. You know, we know all of the different state and local contacts in our various regions that we represent, but we can start helping you foster those relationships so that you know who to turn to, who to ask when things come up. Really appreciate you guys joining us, and we look forward to seeing y'all on February 19th.